Hey everyone, this is Baylor, and welcome to the Scooby-Doo channel. If you haven't been here before, I'm a developer and I like to build stuff, and I like to teach people how to build stuff. So if you haven't subscribed, be sure to subscribe because I think you'll enjoy the content if you enjoy this video, because this is me. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at building a full stack application with Docker, C#, Rails, and JavaScript. And so we're going to build a basic garage application. I'm not sure how in depth it'll actually get because we're going to cover a bunch of topics just so that you can kind of see how a software developer might go about building an application stack. So I'm in a clean directory here, and the first thing we're going to do is just add, we're going to run .NET, and we're going to create a new web project. We're going to name that Garage OAuth. And so that's going to build a new directory here. Web is the template that we're using, and we're naming it Garage OAuth, and so you can see that it's created a directory here called Garage OAuth. So that if we look in here, we cd into that Garage OAuth, you can see we have a very simple .NET application, and if we run .NET run, this is a good first thing to do when you build an application, is to try to run it and make sure that things are actually working. And so if I hop over here at port 5000, you can see we get hello world, and so that indicates to us that this server is running. So the first thing I'm going to do is I actually have this gitignore file that I download. And so we're going to init this or create a new Git repository with this gitignore file as our first commit. And we're going to create this project, and then we are going to just add the .NET web project. So I'm going to edit this .NET application inside of an IDE called Writer. I find Writer to be, it's just a really good IDE if you use C# on a regular basis, both for web projects and console applications. If you want to see why I think it's great, I can make a video on that, but I won't go into that right now. What we're going to do is when we start this project in .NET Core, it's going to start program.cs. That's kind of like your main. Well, it has the main method, so it is your main, I guess. You can see it builds this web host with this startup class, and so startup is basically where you write all the configuration for .NET Core applications. And as you can see here down at the bottom, when we configure the application or the application builder, we're telling it to run and write a string to the response of hello world, which is what we saw when we ran this application. So you can kind of see how this works. What we're going to do is we're going to modify this so that instead of it trying to run something directly, we're going to say app.use identity server. Oh, well, we can't do that. We have to have the dependency first. So we're going to manage our dependencies, and we're going to identity server 4. And so we'll just add that to the project. And now that that's done, now we can do that. We can say app.add identity server, use identity server. I always get these backwards, and not near as much as when I make a video, unfortunately. So what happens down here is when the application starts, it's basically going to run through here and see what do we need to use. But to use any of these down here in our configuration, we need to these method names are really bad. To actually use identity server, we need to tell .NET MVC to add identity server, and we do that up here in the configure services method. So we'll say services.add identity server, and we need to define a few things. We need to tell it to add a developer signing credential. We're going to leave these as persist as true, and we're not going to change the file name. And this developer signing credential is just an RSA key that is used to sign your certificate, or not certificates, your tokens. And so this is something you wouldn't want to use in prod most likely, but it is completely fine here. And when we use Docker, this will still work fine most likely. So when we add a developer signing certificate or credential, this will get added and generated on the fly. The next thing we need to do is add an in-memory client store. And so the clients are your OAuth clients. They're any application that you want to have that uses your OAuth server, you'll register that here. And we're using in-memory because we're not going to have it where users can dynamically create clients. So we'll have a class called config, and we'll just call clients on that. And we also need to add a identity resource. And then finally, the last thing we need to do is we need to add an in-memory API resource as well. So this, if once we define our clients, our identity resources and API resources, identity server is going to be running fully going for us. And most likely, this would probably be satisfying or satisfactory for whatever you're using identity server for. So we're going to add that config class. This will be static, and we're going to define that we have an IEnumerable of client. There we go. And so this is that method for our memory clients. And here we're just going to return a new list of client, and so we'll build a new client inside of here. And I don't want to have parentheses on that. And so, like I said, this client is actually your OAuth client. So we'll give this a client ID. We'll just say garage because that's the application we're building. We'll give it a client name of garage as well. This is used to identify the client. Obviously, it's an identifier, but the name is used whenever a user is logging in and they're saying, do you want to grant this application to have access to your data? Client name is what's like this application garage to access your data. And we need to define a few other things. This one's not as important. We're going to specify the token type. And we're going to force this to be JWT. You can learn about reference tokens as well. That's depending on the security that you're using. Like at my job, we're using reference tokens because we want to have full control over the life of those tokens. But JWT is going to be perfectly fine here, and it's common, much more standard. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to specify that we allow in browser tokens, and so that's going to allow a JavaScript client to say, I'm garage, I need to have access to this user's data, and so that'll change that will change the way that or allow that access at least. And this also gives us a chance to change our grant types, and we're just going to say that implicit. Yeah, so we're doing an implicit grant type, and you can learn about the flows inside of OpenID Connect and OAuth somewhere else. I way too deep to get into here, but we're going to use implicit here because that's fine for our needs. And then finally, the last thing we'll define is our allowed scopes. And we're going to define these. We're going to go through our identity. These end up linking out to claim types. OpenID is definitely required. Profile and email aren't so much. But if you look at these, you can see that, well, it doesn't tell you here, but there's a whole list of claims that are underneath. Here they are. You have name, family name, given name, middle name, nickname, and all this information. Basically, profile information. Email is email and email verified claim types. So we're saying you're allowed to access basically anything you want about a user that we would ever probably contain in this application. The next thing we're going to do is we need to define our identity resource. And so we'll just hop back into our config class, add another static IEnumerable of identity resource. Identity resources is the method name. And identity resources is basically just telling OpenID what resources are available on the user. And so this is going to be very similar to our allowed scopes. So we'll return a new list of identity resource. And we'll just specify here that we want to have the new identity resources. And here we'll put an S on here so we have access to OpenID. And we'll put in profile and email as well. And then finally, we need to define our API resources. And this is required, I guess, for us to use the browser token type. And so here we'll specify that we have a IEnumerable of API resource. It's called API resources, new list of API resource. And here we're going to define a new API resource. And we're going to name this our garage API. And here we can define what our claim types are. And so we'll define these with some default claim types that are part of OpenID. And so we're going to give back our given name, our family name, and our email address, because those are pretty much the only three things that we really care about on a particular user. We can also give back their subject, which might not be that bad as well. That'll give us kind of like a username or a unique identifier for our user to use. And then finally, what we need to do is, now that we've defined this API resource, we need to make that available as our scope. And then finally, what we'll do is, we've defined this client. What we also need to do is tell it how do we go back. So when a client says they want to log in, we say, well, they're allowed to log in from, and here we'll just do localhost port 3000 because we're doing a create React app, and that's the default port that runs on. And so now if we hit startup, I'll make sure to set a breakpoint. Now when we hit startup, you can see everything is good here. And if we try to run, and it started. So if we hop into Chrome here, and I can't go into the right application, refresh, we're going to get a new type of error. But if we go to well-known OpenID configuration, you can see this is the discovery endpoint. This is part of OpenID. Identity Server provides this out of the box. And you can see here that it's telling us like what are our scopes that are allowed. But what happens here is, whenever you register a new OpenID client, it'll hit this URL and it'll configure itself. So all you have to do is specify what's your authority, which in our case is port 5000. Also, you can see if we go to this particular URL, this will give us our public keys. And this public key matches like I said, whenever this runs, if we list, you can see we have this temp-key.rsa file. And so this is whenever we added this developer signing credential, it created that file for us. And so anytime we sign a JWT access token, it's going to sign it with this particular developer credential. And this is important because if we wanted, we'll get to it later, but if we wanted to verify a particular signed JWT, we need access to this private RSA token. And so with Docker, what we'll do is we'll actually copy this and share this between our Rails app and our .NET application so that we can sign it and verify it with the same tokens. And so if you notice, though, when we ran the application, we can't see it now, but we got that 404. It looked like this, if this isn't exactly. And so what we want to do is we want to add the Identity Server Quick Start. And so Identity Server provides a full UI for managing your application. And it starts with in-memory. It's very easy to turn this to use persisted. And so what we can do is, it looks like we need to add MVC and static file rendering. You can see here we add that here. And then we're going to download this. I'm going to do this part first since I'm already on this page. And so when that ran, you can see it's extracted a bunch of files in a whole bunch of places all over my machine. Now my machine is corrupt. But if we look at this, you can see that it's added some Identity Server stuff. I would recommend going ahead and give this a read. I'm pretty familiar with it, so I'll add Quick Start. So yes, we'll do that first. And then what we want to do is we want to add our MVC. And so I'm just going to do that from inside of JetBrains writer, just so I can be sure this gets added correctly. So ASP.NET core.mvc, very important. I guess this begins with Microsoft. So we want to add our MVC package, and we also want to add our static files. And you can see those are added both successfully. And so now we can come up here and say that we want to tell our services to add MVC. And then down here, we're going to tell, before we do Identity Server, we're going to say we want to use static files. And then down here, we'll say app use MVC. And so now if we run .NET Run, we should actually see this load up and give us a very, very handsome UI. There we go. So now we can see that we have Identity Server running here. This all comes part of the Quick Start. It gives you a link to that discovery document, which we've looked at. And more importantly, what it does is it gives you 2 users to play with. And so you can see those inside of Quick Start Test Users. And you can see that we have 2 users. Username is Alice, password is Alice, username is Bob, password is Bob. It logs me in, shows I'm Bob up here at the top, and it shows me I haven't given access to any applications. So I'm going to say that we are now done with actually adding our identity server. So now we're going to create our graphical or React client. So I've already installed Create React App. It's an npm package. We're going to name this Garage Client, and what I'm going to do is specify my scripts version, and I'm going to use the React scripts TypeScript version of this, or flavor. It is a flavor of the Create React app. And I am a huge fan of TypeScript. I think it makes development a lot easier across a team. And so out of the box, I want to go ahead and set this up to use the TypeScript project. I can give you a link to that. So the Create React App TypeScript comes from wmonk. I don't know how they maintain this. I imagine it's a lot of work, but they do a very good job at it. And so you can just kind of read through what this thing does, how to use it. The only thing my only complaint, which is probably just because I'm maybe a lousy developer, is it's super strict out of the box with the tsconfig, but that is fine. We will change that ourselves. So we can go into our Garage client, and we want to make sure this thing starts. So I run npm start. So what we'll do here is we want to add an OpenID Connect library. So that, oh, is this running? No, that's why I started the tmux session.net run. Because what we want to be able to do is be in our React app. We want to be able to click a button to log in and go through the process on port 5000 to identity server, and then receive our user over here in our React application. And that is what we're going to do now. So just making sure all this is still running. It is. I'll log out so we get the full experience of logging in. What we're going to do is inside of our OAuth, or I'm sorry, oh, I didn't mean to stop that server. Over here, we're going to stop this server. Oh, another thing is I'm going to start a project here. I'm going to open up WebStorm. And while that's opening in the background, we're going to say npm install OIDC client. And we're going to save that. And so OIDC client, the documentation for this is pretty rough. It's like super rough, but it is a very feature complete and very powerful little library to have access to for working with OpenID Connect. So here we are inside of WebStorm. For the observant viewers out there, you may have noticed that I typoed my scripts version, and so I actually had the regular JavaScript version. That has been fixed. So yeah. So we're going to hop into App TSX. And what we want to do is a very simple version to give us a way to view our current user and just log in and just kind of make sure everything is working here before we tear all this down to start with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a new component. So we'll say new TypeScript file. We'll call this our current user TSX. And so what I'm going to do is just have an import React and component from React. So we'll define a current user component, and we'll define our render just so that we define the very minimum here. And export that as our default current user. Perfect. And then over here, what we'll do is we're just going to output out whatever is in our current user component. And here we go again. Like, I'll show you. If I refresh, it says, well, it has no default export. That's not true. It does have. So what I need to also do is tell this thing that I want to allow synthetic imports as true. Which now, I think I had to restart the server when I make a change like that. And I don't know what I'm missing here. This thing, like I said, this thing is like super strict. And I don't know, it doesn't like any's, it doesn't like this, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't like anything. And so I'm not certain which thing to change to give myself a little bit more freedom, but that should fix that. So now, yeah, expects double quote to be a single quote. Thank you. Refresh, and we should, missing a semicolon. Ugh. There we go. Okay, so we have our current user component loading. And what we're going to do is we are going to import OIDC from OIDC client. And when we boot up, we're going to find a constructor. We'll take in our props, called super props. We will satisfy the React. That's not true. That's not it. What is this not happy about? Oh, thank you. And we'll say this site user manager. Oh, that's right. We have to say user manager is equal to user manager. And we'll say this dot user manager is equal to new OIDC dot user manager. Oh, that's what it is. And so this is this user manager, this is going to be configured. I'm leaving everything isolated to this single component. When we start restructuring this, we'll actually pull this up higher, closer to our index, so that we pass it down into app. But right now, this will be fine. Okay, so I'm just trying to get the TypeScript thing here to be happy with what I'm doing. So we need to find our authority, which will just be localhost port 5000. We'll need to specify our client ID, which is our garage. Okay, so we're defining just some basic configuration pieces. We're specifying that our authority is port 5000, which is where our identity server is living here. We defined that we're using the garage client, which is what we defined over here as our client ID. And our redirect URI matches what we just specified here at port 3000. And we're specifying that we're using ID token, and token is a response type that'll match the implicit flow. And then finally, we're specifying that our scope, we want access to the OpenID profile email and garage API. And so that'll give us access to everything that we need. And so what we'll do is we'll also specify that we are going to define our state. And this will just have a user, which will be an OIDC.user. And so we'll specify this can be any, and which it may not like, but it will have to live with that. And so this will allow us to say, and also we'll have a loading Boolean. So we'll define this. Oh, I need to also specify this allows a null value. Perfect. Okay, so we're defining our state, and it matches our, it can be null or it can be OIDC user. And what we want to do is when we render, we'll just say if this.state.loading, then return a div that just says loading. If our user is null, then we'll return a message to say welcome new user, and we'll give them a button to log in. And then finally, if they are logged in, then what we can do is we'll say welcome, and we'll say this.state.user.profile.given name, which now what we're doing is we're getting into that claim that we're allowing access to. So we allow access to the given name claim type, and so we're calling profile.given name, and we'll provide them a button to log out since they're logged in. And so now if we refresh this page, we're missing a semicolon on line 6. Okay, you can see we get into just loading because we've not loaded technically this application yet. What I mean by that is we haven't tried to access the current user, and this is all asynchronous. And so what we'll do is we're going to say our component did mount, what we want to do here is call our user manager and say get user, and this returns a promise. And so we'll just say user equals await our user, and we need to specify this is async. Okay. And so what we'll do here is we're going to say if our user is null, then we're not going to do anything, because we don't have a user. Okay, it's still upset because I haven't actually done anything. I'm just saying it is null. This means our user is not logged in. Otherwise, we're going to say this.set state, and we're going to specify a user here. And we'll also specify that loading is now false. Although I guess I don't have to do anything. I can just do this. We don't really care if, we don't want that. So if user is null, we don't really care. I guess that's true, because we're already checking to see if user is null. And I will do this just so that I have a little bit of white space between my object, or my string, and my button. So now you can see we get our welcome new user, and we have our link to log in, or a button. And so what we'll do is we're going to define a new method. We don't want to do that here. We want to do this up here. And we're going to say this.login equals this.login.bind to this. We'll define this new method, login. And we'll say that when we click our button, we're just going to call this.login. And so this method, what we'll do is we'll say this site user manager dot sign in redirect. And so this is everything that we need to do. Whenever I click this button, you can see it's going to try, and it apparently failed. I don't care about this, thank you. So we have a CORS origin, no cross-origin scripting. So we need to go back into our server here. We're going to say services.add CORS, and I also need to do CORS equals new default CORS policy service. This is a bunch of stuff. Private logger factory, public startup, iLogger factory. That's right, I probably want to make this interface as well. Logger factory. Okay, I just did this last night, so that's the only reason I even know what I'm doing here. We're using dependency injection on the startup class to say we need a logger factory, and that is required for this default CORS policy service. And so we're just going to say logger factory dot create logger, and here we pass in our default CORS policy service. And we're going to configure this to allow all is true. This is probably not the most secure way of doing this, but I'm okay with that. CORS policy service, and we'll pass in the CORS here. And so all I've done here is I've just said that we're adding CORS, which we'll configure in a second, but we're also telling Identity Server that when it asks for our policy service, to use what we defined here as allow all. And so I trust, I'm partly, or mostly at least, trusting that Identity Server is going to take care of like who's allowed to use this and whatnot. Even though it's definitely not the most secure way of doing it, it will work for our demo. And finally, we're going to say we're going to use CORS and define those options and say allow any header, allow any method, allow any origin, and credentials, allow credentials. Okay, and so now I'll just hop over here and restart this server. And that should fix this issue that we're having here, where we can't actually hit that. And there we go, that fixed it. So if we go back to localhost port 3000, you can see when I click login, it redirects us over to port 5000. Here we're going to type in Bob and Bob, login. You can see that it is saying, do we want to grant access to Garage? Which, there it is, Garage is up here at the top, hidden by my scrolling. And so we're going to give access to everything. When you define these claims and these scopes, you can define what's optional. So like you can say like this one's required. You can say like profiles required and email address required, but we're not going to worry about that. We're going to give them all of them. When we hit allow, yes, allow, it redirects back. However, as you can see, we didn't actually log in. And so that's a step that we need to run manually. And so what we'll do here is inside of WebStorm, what we'll do is we're going to, in our component did mount, is we will say that we're going to check and see if the URL matches. And so if this is, if the, well, actually we'll do it this way. We'll say we're looking for this ID token up here. So ID token dot test our window.location.hash. And so what we're doing here is when we mount, and we'll actually do this and else maybe. Don't know if I'm liking this. Actually, what I may do is also just create a new user or a new method down here called load user. And that will take care of this bit right here. Like this async. Now we don't need the async method up here. Perfect. And this we'll call load user. And then what we'll do is when we see that we have ID token up here in the URL, then what we'll do is we'll know that we need to say user manager dot sign in callback. And this will give us a promise. And so we'll wait this. And so what we can do here is we're actually just going to get the user from this. So we'll say, and this actually needs to come async again. Actually, yeah, we'll do it this way. Var user equals await our sign in redirect callback. And here we'll say this dot, this actually feels really bad. What we'll do is we'll specify user up here. Equal to null. Needs to be a type of oidc.user or null equals null by default. And here we'll say user equals user or this. There we go. And so with that little bit of a trick, what we can do is we define that we want to get our user here and say load user with a user here. And so what's happening here, missing white space. Oh, one's white space between that. Yeah, this thing's like super strict. Okay. And that did not give me my user. So let's log out and like log back in and try that again. That doesn't work. So to log out, this will be another step here. This dot log out equals this dot log out dot bind to this. And we'll say that when we click our log out button, we go to log out and log out. Super, super simple. Log out is this dot user manager dot sign out redirect. And so we're doing the redirect options here. Did we get an error? Not found. No magic state found in storage. I don't want that. That doesn't help us. I wanted to see more of where it came from. Component did mount. Do we have anything in our session storage? I might have actually broken it. Let's clear it and refresh. Oh, we don't want this. We want to start over from scratch. New user, log in. Yes, allow. Okay, that brings us back, but we did not actually see our name. So what did I miss? So I want to copy this key, which I will copy that way, and we'll parse that by going to our session storage for this particular key. And we can take a look and see what our profile has on it. And it does not have everything that I wanted to see. So we didn't get any of the scopes. What did I miss? And oh, the quick start. The quick start, whatever you call this thing. This, I don't know if this was deliberate. Where is it? It is in sign-in async. This method takes a fourth parameter that takes the claims. So we'll say user.claims.toArray. I can't tell you how many times I have missed that. And so what we need to do is we need to restart our server, and we need to log out and do the process over again. So we're logged out now. We'll go back to localhost port 3000. We'll log in. We'll say we're Bob, log in. We'll give consent to Garage. And now you can see we have our Bob name pop up. And if we run that again to look at all our information, you can see that we have this. We have our email coming back. We have our family and given name. And so if we were going to connect this to our actual our Rails application, this gives us everything we need. We really only need this. What we would do is we would hand over this access token, and then we will. There is Ruby JWT. This thing, what we'll do is we'll tell it that we want to. This is probably gonna be RS-256. This this temp key RSA that is being used by our garage is very likely going to be RS-256. And so what we'll do is we'll just say that we want to, we'll tell that we're not going to generate one. We're going to load one from disk, and then we're going to parse that token, and that'll give us our object. And this allows us to have access to everything that the application has here. And the reason this is secure is that, like, you could, I mean, you really probably could generate an access token like this, right? This access token wouldn't be that hard to generate, but the reason why it's secure is that because this has been signed, and we're gonna, when we verify it, we're gonna decode it with that same signing or signature, and so that'll allow us to ensure that we're not just taking in whatever token we're given. We're gonna use the same signing certificate to decode it. Now I'll do that in the next video. What I will do real quick. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to set this up with Docker Compose. And so I don't have this running anymore. We have our application, and we want to be able to set it up where we can very quickly start both our node application or process and also our identity server process. And so we'll start with the node since it's very simple. We're going to create a new Docker file. It is not happy because I was recording this and then paused recording and I lost my changes or my video. So I'm starting over. We're going to say we load this from our node, and we're going to specify our version as node 940 Alpine. I think that's still the latest. I'm not certain. And what we'll do is this is defining our base image to build our new Docker container on. And so we want to start with a node version of 940. And then we'll specify our work directory as app. And so we're building, this starts it starts on Alpine Linux, very small Linux distro. We're creating a new directory at the root called app. And what we want to do is we're basically going to define the steps to starting our node application as if though we were on a brand new machine. And so what we'll also do is, like, what we could do is just say, like, copy everything over and say run npm install, and then our command to actually run this server is npm start. And I'm piping this into cat here so that our React scripts won't sit there and try to do the thing where it refreshes the window in front of you. It'll just write it out and like standard out. And so we could do this. This is everything we need to actually make our application run inside Docker. We can make it better because instead of trying to copy everything over, if we only copy over our package.json and our package lock and then run npm install, if these files don't change, it'll just step over and run straight to this. And that'll make our application process so much faster because the next step would be copy everything over. And so what will happen with this is we'll start with our dependencies. If our dependencies don't change, we don't need to reinstall everything. And then we'll copy the entire project over, all the files and stuff. And when we run our container, it'll run npm start. That's what the command does. Run runs during the build, and command runs when you start the container. And the next thing we can do is we can add a Docker ignore file. And I'm going to make this list out everything in line. And basically we're going to go into here and we're going to say anything that's not necessary to actually build this container, don't copy the files over. So like we don't need our Git directory and files. We don't need our dia for JetBrains. Don't need our Docker file. Don't need our README. Don't need our node modules. We do, however, need the rest of this. So we'll delete that. And now what we can do is, what I'll do is say system prune. You don't have to do this. I'm doing this real quick so that I clear things out. So now what we can do is say Docker build. We're going to tag this as garage client. And we're going to build with the context as our current directory. And so what this is doing is it is saying I need node 940. I already had it, so it did that very quickly. I've done this in the past, so it says my work directory app hasn't changed, so I'm using the cache. It copies over our package files, and it realizes this is different since the last time I built this container, and so it is going ahead and running npm install. So that finished. This takes a while on my slower internet. And so it did finally finish. It ran the npm install, got the packages, and then it's storing that as a particular version or hash. And then what it's going to do is it's copying over the files, and it's registering that when we run our container, that we're going to run npm and start with piping that into cat so that we get standard out. And so now we can actually play with this and see this will work. Because if I go back to my browser and refresh, you can see the server's not running. And so what we'll do is we'll say that we want to say docker run or container run. I'm going to --rm -it. And so what this will do is say remove the container whenever I stop it. IT puts it in more like an interactive state. And I'm going to port forward 3000 to 3000. What this will do is it's going to take, this is my host machine. So on my laptop, when I go to port 3000, it's going to go to port 3000 inside of that container because these containers run their own networks. And what I'm going to do is just say that I want to run my GraphQL client. And so if I run that, oh, it's not GraphQL client, it's Garage client. So I run that again, and you can see that it's running, it goes into our app directory, and this is actually running npm start. And you can see it's put out 3000, and this is localhost to the container. But if I refresh the page, you can see our React app is running. Now, the only downside is that if I go in here and I try to change this, so I come in here and I say like from Docker, and I save this, you can see nothing happens. It didn't actually refresh. And even if I reload the page, it still doesn't refresh. And the reason for that is that, and I'll stop this. The reason for that is in this Docker file, we said copy. That's a one-time operation. When I build the container, then it copies the files. And we don't want that. We want to make it just like it is normally, otherwise it defeats the whole purpose. And so what we can actually do is when we run this container, we're going to attach a volume. We're going to make it the current directory, and we're going to mount that at /app. And so what happens is, even though we built the application with a particular version of our app, and we copied those files over there, we're saying when we run this, override that app directory with whatever is in my current directory. And so anything you can do as if that you are running it locally, you can do now. And so when we refresh, which we are there, you can see we have our from Docker. If I come over and I make a change and I say with live changes and I save and refresh, you can see now we get our with live changes. But you may notice this is going to last this is my last this isn't the same as you're used to. We don't get live reload. And the reason for that is we need to forward a special port. So just like we forwarded our port 3000, we need to port 35729, and this is for live reload. And so now And what we'll do is I'm just going to hop over into WebStorm and say and live reload. And when I save this and I come over, hand off the keyboard, I have to probably refresh it to get this started. Okay, well, let me undo this. We'll say from Docker exclamation mark with explicit space, and I hands off the keyboard, it refreshed. And you had to just trust me that hands were off the keyboard, but it was. And so that's what we need to do to actually get this container running with live reload. Well, we'll check out our source, and then what we'll do is we'll say that we add Docker support. Now, the last thing we want to do is we don't want to have to come in here and say Docker run, container run, rm it-p-p-v. We don't want to have to do that every time we want to start this server. And so what we'll do is we'll hop over here. We're at the root of our our directory here. That's why I've structured it this way. We're going to create a file called dockercompose.yaml, and we're going to specify the version is 3.4. And even though we're probably not doing 3.4 specific things, I'm just using the latest. We're going to define our services, and we're going to say we have a client service. We're going to say that the image name of this is our garage client, and we're going to build that from that garage client directory. And so what that is, it's actually going into this directory, garage client here. And so what we'll do is we also need to specify the ports that we want to forward. So we'll say ports, and we'll define here that we go from 3000 to 3000, and we also go to that 35729 to 35729. And so we're basically, what you can kind of see here is whatever we define in our container run command here, we're redefining inside of our Docker Compose. And so what we'll also do is we'll mount our volume, and we'll say this mounts from our garage client to /app. Now here's where Docker Compose is very cool, is that this // is relative to this Docker Compose file. So if we look at this, you can see we have Docker Compose, and we're saying go into Docker Garage Client. We don't have to give this absolute path since it's running through Docker Compose. We do, however, on our container side we do, but not on our host. And so with this done, we can say Docker Compose build, and this will try to build everything. You can see it's already done because we've done that before. So now we can say Docker Compose up -d. I'm passing in -d to make it run as a daemon. So as you can see, I'm free to type whatever I want here. And I will refresh. The server hasn't started yet. It looks like it's coming up. And you can see we have our create app. And if I hop over and we make a change to this file with Docker Compose and hit that, I didn't hit a keyboard. It just worked on its own. So that is setting this up with Docker Compose. That's not what you need to see. This is our Docker Compose file. And what's cool is we can say Docker Compose down, and we'll stop the services. And so I'm probably going to leave the video here. This video is getting quite long. This will give you, in the next video, we'll do another Docker file for our .NET application. We'll link this all to Docker Compose, and then we'll start adding our Rails application, and I'll probably release that video next week. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section. I'm always happy to answer questions. And if you like this video, be sure to like it and subscribe because there's more coming. Thank you for watching this video. I'm Baylor Ray, and goodbye.